Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bonn. Welcome to the UN climate negotiations, literally from the inside. As you can see behind me, there are negotiators everywhere. They're all kind of hanging out. We just had a long day of negotiations. It just kicked off today. Today was the first of what we have about 12 days of negotiations ahead of us. There's going to be a lot of kind of key decisions made this week, but it's all in preparation to the Paris meeting at the end of the year. So this meeting is more of a kind of trying to flesh out some of the key issues, trying to get to some of the key conversations, and trying to kind of make our way in a small step on the pathway towards Paris, which obviously you are all kind of following along and kind of ready to push these negotiators along as fast as possible. So I'm really excited that you're all joining us here today. And you know, as usual, jump on Twitter if you want to ask any questions. Jump on the Google Hangout page. We have a really cool lineup for you today. We've got two past trackers who are with us here in Bonn. And you know, we've got a number of cool announcements talking about some of the climate call for climate amazing things you guys have been doing, talking about some of the webinars we're going to be hosting later this week with negotiators and with NGO experts, and giving you a bit of a taste of what the UN climate negotiations is all about. So thank you so much for joining us, and I really can't wait to kind of engage with all of you over Twitter, have you kind of linked into all the conversations that we're going to be having this week, and I can't wait to share some of the little secrets we have later on in this call. Before I do, I just wanted to give a first kind of wrap up of our call for climate effort. It was absolutely amazing. I'm kind of gobsmacked right now. I don't know if you've been following the Twitter hashtag call for climate, hashtag call for climate, or if you've been following the Facebook group. If you haven't, find the Facebook group, jump in the call for climate hashtag. So far, we've had over 180 articles, including front page stories in Ghana and Madagascar. We've had articles that have been shared over 8,000 times. We've reached leading newspapers and media outlets in 65 different countries, and almost 2/3 of everyone, and this is the most amazing thing that I can imagine, almost 2/3 of everyone who published something over the last week or so did so for the first time. So that means that more than 100 newly activated climate activists right around the world, all of you people watching in, you know, more than 100 of you watching in right now have gone out and published a piece in a new media for the first time. And that's amazing. That's kind of exactly the type of engagement and effort and kind of passion and pushing yourself that we're looking for. And I'm kind of amazed at that. So as a quick summary, we've got some exciting announcements for the call for climate stories and what we're going to be doing with them here in Bonn later on. But as a quick summary, I'm just kind of amazed at it. And I wanted to kind of preface this call by saying we still have 4 days left. We still have basically the end of this week to publish pieces. And you know, if you're feeling inspired or kind of feeling like you've got one piece left in you, it would be amazing to get some more pieces out. And I'll tell you exactly why you want to do that later on in the call. But I'm going to hand back over to Josh, and I'm going to welcome in Raquel and Federico, two of our past trackers, and Josh will tell you exactly about them and give them the chance to give you a little insight into the climate negotiations. How you going, Josh?
Thanks, Chris. So my name's Josh Weezy, and I've worked on the Climate Tracker and Adopt the Negotiator stuff for 6 years, since 2009. So it's been really exciting to see this grow over the years, and it's been especially exciting to watch the results of this first global call for climate action. I think it's promising for what we could do together in the coming months as we lead up to Paris. I want to introduce you to two friends who have been a part of our program in the past, some favorite alumni who are in Bonn with us, volunteering on the Climate Tracker team. So just real quick hellos, and then we'll dig into some questions to you guys. Fede, can you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Federico. I'm from Italy. I live in Rome, and I'm 23 years old. I studied environmental engineering, but then I dedicated the last 5 years to following the climate negotiations, starting from Durban. And last year, I was lucky enough to be selected in the Adopt a Negotiator team for Lima COP20.
Thanks, Fede. And Raquel, maybe you can point the camera down a little so we can see you better. Thanks. Introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm Raquel. I'm from Brazil. I'm 25. And my first COP was COP19 in Warsaw. I was part of Adopt a Negotiator team at the time. And I'm the founder and general coordinator of Engajamundo, and youth-led initiative in Brazil that I'm going to tell you about a little bit more later.
Thank you both. Okay, I wanted to give those of you out there watching a sense of what climate trackers do during the negotiations. So Fede, going back to you, could you summarize the role of a tracker when you're in a place like Bonn or maybe in a place like Paris coming up?
Definitely. Well, first of all, I want to be clear that being a good tracker means meeting a lot of requirements. You don't necessarily have to meet all of them, but the perfect and ideal tracker is able to do many things, possibly at the same time. One of the most important things is being able to follow the negotiations. This means sitting in the room inside with negotiators and listening to what they say to each other and try to understand how the negotiations are evolving. So this is a more technical aspect that you have to be able to cover if you want to get the most updated information yourself rather than listening them from someone else. The second point is being a good communicator, because you will hear very hard terms and concepts inside those rooms. So if you are a good tracker, you have to be able to write them in articles and to communicate them in a very simple way so that any audience in your country or internationally can understand what's actually going on in the room. The third point is being very active and being propositive. I will tell you later a brief experience that I had in the last few months, which is a good example, I think, of what young people can do inside this conference center to have an impact and to leave an impact in the negotiations. And fourth, you definitely must be able to establish good relations with negotiators, because if you want to get information, you must have to have good contact with them so that you can also exchange ideas and perhaps trying to push them towards what you consider being a good solution or a good proposal.
Thanks, Fede. That's great. And I think a lot of those same things apply to folks who are tracking from afar. So you can get started on all of that, including building relationships with your negotiators now, even if you're not in a place like Bonn. But going back to the negotiations, what was your most exciting experience as a tracker so far, or at least what is that recent experience that you hinted at earlier?
Well, I think the best experience I had was last February in Geneva. There was another intersessional meeting. And I was working to promote the principle of intergenerational equity, which is basically the principle according to which we should leave the planet to future generations in no worse condition than those we inherited from our ancestors. And we've been working with other people from all over the world throughout the last 2 years. And finally, in last February, we had a chance to propose a statement on intergenerational equity to a few countries, and some of them decided to adopt these proposals, and they actually mentioned them during their interventions in a plenary session, and thus the principles was actually included in the negotiating text. This was an amazing success, because I would never expect, just like 1 year or 2 years ago, that young people could actually come here and have a concrete impact. So not just communicating what is happening here, but also contributing to make this process successful. And that was it was the best moment I had in this process.
Thanks, Fede. That's great. So, so you've been able to actually influence the negotiations themselves, working with our partners and allies around the world, group effort, and you got to be on the action end of that change. That's fantastic. And Raquel, I know you've had some similar experiences, but also being a tracker can have an impact beyond the negotiations. So, tell us what the most exciting thing that came out of your tracker experience is as well. Please share.
Yeah, so you can contribute to the negotiations, as Fed was saying. You can work on your media skills, because I have never written an article before being a tracker, and I've been developing my skills since then, and it's a really important thing. And sometimes you get so addicted to it that you still wear the shirt even if you don't. But anyways, the main thing for me was how Adopt a Negotiator enabled me to create the movement in a national level. So as I mentioned before, I'm one of the founders of an organization called Engajamundo in Brazil. It means Engage World. And our idea is to mobilize and do capacity building with young people to international participation, not only on the climate talks, but also on the sustainable development goals, the gender agenda, and also habitat, other themes that now the Brazilian youth is engaged on, because we could build this movement through my experience on Adopt a Negotiator. So COP19 was the first time Engajamundo got to go to a conference, and that was totally because of the experience of Adopt a Negotiator. And it made the movement stronger. It gave us capacity to do capacity building in a national level with other young persons. And it was really amazing for me. And I'm sure that all the success that we had these 2 years through Engajamundo started when I was approved in the Adopt a Negotiator process.
That's probably more credit than we deserve, but thanks, Raquel. That's fantastic. Can you bring it back to the negotiations and just tell us maybe a story quickly about an article that you wrote that pressured negotiators? So how is your writing having an impact, or how has it had an impact in the talks?
Yeah, so first of all, even before the text, there is a negotiation on education, training, public participation here. And of course, this is the most interesting thing for us as young people, because, I mean, education and training is the base for us to build a national youth movement. So I was in the negotiation of this article of the convention. This is the Article 6. You may heard a lot about it. And there was no Brazilian negotiator in these discussions. So I first started to push them to get someone there to represent our country and to develop things on education and training and public participation. And then during the negotiations, I wrote a paragraph for the Brazilian negotiators to present as their own position, which was one of the methodologies that we use as Engajamundo in a national level, called the training of trainers. So you bring many people from all the regions of Brazil, because, you know, Brazil is too big, so it's really hard to go everywhere. So we bring young people from all over the country, and we do a training with them, and they can multiply this methodology in their local communities. So this is a methodology that we use and that we were able to put in the text through presenting this paragraph that Brazil presented as its own during the negotiations, and it was approved. So it was a really nice experience as well.
Thanks. So you can put it all together with the connections that you guys out there in the audience are building with other trackers, with civil society, climate movement folks in your country, and increasingly around the world. You know, combine your writing skills to plant seeds and bring those ideas in front of negotiators and other decision makers, and then continue working with those folks to add pressure to bring it to life in policy. and in other ways, which we're seeing with groups like Engagemundo, and Fede does similar stuff with the Italian Climate Network. So Fede, back to you. Could you just tell us, so we have an audience obviously not in Bonn, and hopefully some of them will be able to join us in Paris. You did the Climate Tracker thing, and then you came with us to Lima. Thinking back on your time as a Climate Tracker, would you change anything, or what advice do you have for folks who are tracking from afar, who are maybe pitching stories to newspapers, prepping, hoping to go to Paris? What would you do differently, or what would you emphasize if you could do it all again?
Well, this is not an easy question to to answer, but there is actually something that I think I could have done better, and that I can actually do better, even in my experience here in Bonn, which is trying to establish more solid relations with negotiators. This is, I think, one of the most important parts of our role. Sorry.
Looks like we might have a bit of a frozen Wi-Fi situation, which is why we're in two different locations, just in case that happens. So bear with us while we try and get these guys back. They're across town in the Bonn Conference Center. I'm in a nearby town called Bad Godesberg, where the Climate Tracker team is staying. Might be able to get them back. Please bear with me while I try and loop them back in. Okay, so I think what we're going to do now is catch you guys up with a little taste of the negotiations. So we'll jump back to the team in the conference center once they can reestablish a Wi-Fi link. But in the meantime, want to give you guys a taste of an opening presser that happened earlier today. Some of our friends and colleagues gave their perspective on day one, kind of what is the big picture context in Bonn, what are the key elements in the negotiations, and how does it all, how does the inside world connect with the outside world, give you guys a taste of some of those difficult terms that are hard to communicate. So I'm going to try and pipe this in.
Hey, we're back.
Oh, okay, well, hold that thought. So coming back with Fede. So we're going to cut back over to that press conference in just a minute, but Fede, maybe you can finish your thought.
Yeah, as I was saying, one of the most important parts when you are a member of this tracker team, you must be able to establish very good relations with a negotiator, and so you can get as many information as you can, and they can be as updated as possible. And this is something that I didn't incur very much in my experience. I dedicated more to the negotiations in the room, and so if I could go back, maybe I would try to dedicate some more time to this. And I think this is a crucial part in this role. And also, I would try to expand my my web of contacts in an international media. Most of my contacts and media who usually agree in publishing my articles are Italian. So I would try to expand that and find some international contacts as well to share what we learn here.
Okay, thanks, Fede. That's fantastic. So let's pass it back over to Chris Wright. Bring him in here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how those contacts that you can establish both with media in your country, media outside your country, negotiators, even when you're at home and they are in Bonn, how we can get.
Oh my God. I will, but as soon as we get it going. Come on, there's like 10% of the population using the Wi-Fi right now.
And
Hello,
we're
everyone.
back, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you can see me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. Chris, so go ahead. Tell us about what people can expect this week.
All right, everyone. So now that you've heard from Fede and from Hakel on exactly why you want to become Adopt the Negotiator trackers and how you can become effective as trackers, I want to let you know that we have a great opportunity to affect things even without you being here, because one of the reasons why we've decided to come to these negotiations is we wanted to bring your call for climate articles to the negotiators. We wanted to print them out and hand them to us, hand them to the negotiators ourselves. So we're going to be taking a number of your articles that are kind of related to the negotiations, and we're going to literally running down negotiators, grabbing them, putting your articles in their hands and making sure that they read them, and making sure that they know exactly what, you know, their fellow stakeholders in the Trinidad, in the Philippines, in Madagascar, in Ghana, in all of the countries that you've been writing about. We're going to be selecting a number of those, and we're going to be trying to follow up with negotiators that we think might be interested in reading those articles. So that's one of the amazing ways that you guys are going to be able to affect the negotiations. But outside of that, we're also going to be trying to keep you up to date with everything you need to know from the negotiations. Now, we know a lot of you are coming to these negotiations maybe for the first time, and maybe you're a little bit unclear on exactly why we're negotiating here, what people are talking about, what are those acronyms here. And if you go to the Adopt a Negotiator page right now, Federico just uploaded a blog about the Bonn climate negotiations that can give you a bit of an introduction. But even as you're reading that, you'll notice that there's a few acronyms and there's a few kind of technical issues that maybe you don't know about. So we're going to be interviewing NGO and negotiators this week, NGO leaders and negotiators, and we're going to be doing a back to the basics UNFCCC style, a series of videos, training videos that can give you a real kind of introductory understanding of the UNFCCC and help you all get a kind of a better understanding of why people are negotiating this week, what are some of the key issues, and how you can not only understand them, but better affect them in your next kind of call for climate article part 2. So we're going to be giving you videos every few days around that. We also want to connect you with these negotiations. So we're going to be running a number of webinars this week. Some of them are even going to be in some of the other languages that we know all of you speak. So we've already lined up a webinar in Spanish, where there's going to be a webinar in Portuguese, and we're going to be trying to line up webinars in some other languages as well that you might be interested in. We're going to have webinars with some of the lead negotiators here, as well as with some of the leading NGO personalities that are here with us as well. So expect a lot of webinars from us, a lot of videos, a lot of things that you can learn as much as possibly can over the next 2 weeks. We're also going to be writing a lot of articles about the negotiations. We not only have Hakel and Federico here, we're going to be having Lihi Yona from Canada join us, and later on next week we're going to have Michelina from Poland join us as well. So there's going to be a lot of articles, particularly about some of the European, Brazilian, and Canadian movements this week. But we're also going to be kind of partnering with other NGO partners this week, and we're going to be getting articles from all around the spectrum and all around the globe. So look forward to articles that are really going to keep you up to date with the negotiations And I'm going to be passing those articles on via Twitter. I'm going to be passing them on the Facebook group, and obviously publishing them on adoptanegotiator.org. So keep up to date with that. And we'd love for you to comment on those articles. We'd love for you to kind of engage with us on Twitter. We'd love for you to kind of try and connect with the negotiations as much as possible. The reason why we're here is we want to connect you to the negotiations. So we really hope that you can able to kind of engage with us and follow us on this journey over the next 2 weeks. I know it's going to be exciting. And if you give it some time and really kind of open your mind to it, I hope you'll be able to feel the excitement that Federico and Raquel feel as well. So please kind of engage with that. And just as a final note, you've all kind of, well, many of you have written amazing articles about climate change, about policies you want to see changed, about potential impacts, and about some movements that you want to support. But while we're at the negotiations over the 2 weeks, especially leading up to June 5th, but also kind of after that until June 12th, the negotiations are going to be going on. And feel free to write articles about the negotiations and share them on Twitter. Feel free to email me some of your ideas that you might want to write about, and pitch to me the ideas. And we're going to be trying to kind of get as many of your articles out there on Twitter, on our website, and also in the hands of the negotiators. So I hope that's kind of exciting for you, because it's really exciting for me. We're going to be literally putting your words into the hands of the negotiators, and also trying to keep you as up to date as possible, so that you can understand everything that's going on. So that's some of the updates we have for this week, and I hope you'll be able to join us.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so now we're going to cut over to this Cannes press conference that happened earlier today. Give you a little taste of some of the state of play on day one. We're going to follow that, as long as our connection holds, with an opportunity for those of you watching live to ask questions over Twitter and Facebook. So give me just a second to transition here. Going to load this up.
And we're in for an interesting 2 weeks, I think, if perhaps a little technical 2 weeks. We've got here this morning from France, who's going to give us an overview of some of the developments outside this building today, and then Jaco Duprat from WWF is going to talk to us a little bit about what we expect in terms of the format of the negotiations and how it might play out in terms of the issues. And then Harjeet Singh from ActionAid is going to give us a rundown of, again, some of the we'll hear from our three speakers.
Thank you, Ria. So out in real world, there's a lot behind the climate vote, so that's pretty good news. The question is whether countries are going to pick up the oars. Sorry, I'm not an English speaker, so the oars to sort of paddle a little bit quicker towards that ongoing transition. So among the good news, we have a very interesting report that came out saying how renewable energy is on the rise, creating 7.7 million jobs in 2014. That's 18% more than 2013, so a pretty big jump. There are more and more signs in general that renewable energy is winning the war against coal. China recently announced that they would close down more than 1,000 coal mines in China this year because of decreasing coal consumption. We have the investor community, which is also making pretty strong commitments in AXA and the Norwegian pension, the Norwegian fund coming out strongly to phase out coal funding. We also have more generally the business community backing a long-term goal to shift away from fossil fuels, which is one of the exciting news from the Business and Climate Summit. And finally, all of this echoed by President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel at the Petersburg Dialogue a few weeks back, calling for a long-term decarbonization goal. So all of this good news, very exciting, but, and there's always a but when I'm on a presser, is that the governments, some of the governments are taking it way too slow. So we currently have 37 INDCs on the table submitted to the UNFCCC. They take us one step closer to the 2-degree goal, but definitely not far enough. Japan's INDC, which is a draft INDC, so we're hoping that it's going to get better by the time it's, formally announced, is still heavily going to rely on coal by 2030 and on nuclear power instead of renewable energy. Canada's INDC is turning a blind eye to tar sand pollution and pretending that's not a problem. And overall, most of the INDCs, and that's a big, big problem for the Bonn negotiations here, is the fact that most of the INDCs on the table have an end year in 2030. And that means locking in low ambition for way too long. So these are the problems that we're facing today. And thankfully, that's where and why there is a need for Paris Agreement, and where it can sort of help step up climate action and ambition, both capturing what is going on, but sort of making sure that it's pulling all of this good news together and taking it a step further. So there is an ongoing transition, as I said, but I think the problem is it's mostly disorderly. It's not 100% there, and some of the governments are not being helpful today. So there are two things that the climate agreement, in our view, can do to sort of help. The first thing is a ratchet mechanism. Now, that's a bit of a barbarous word, in my view, to basically say that all INDCs need to be assessed, revisited, and increased at some point, and not in 2030, because for the Ethiopias, Tuvalus, and Philippines of this world, 2030 is a long time away. And if we wait until then, we are facing, catastrophic global warming. The second thing that the climate agreement can do is fix a long-term goal, so that we have this sort of ratcheting up towards something and we know where we're headed. The long-term goal can send a signal to the outside world, actually, to those who aren't taking action yet, to the fossil fuel industry, for example, that from now on, it's all about 100% renewable energy. The G7 is coming up at the end of this week, and hopefully will send that signal that the those 7 big countries are backing a long-term decarbonization and particularly renewable long-term goal. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm just going to add on to what Alex was discussing about those 2 big outcomes and what that means for Bonn this week, and what we need from this session to start reflecting some of what's happening in the real world and the requirements from that. So basically what's happening here in Bonn is that we are discussing the framework or the draft text for the Paris Agreement. That's the first part of the discussions. And then the second part is, how do we close the gap between what's on the table at the moment and what we need to achieve by 2020? So I'm going to go through the first part, the Paris text, quickly, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we can close the gap in the pre-2020 period. So what we have here in Bonn is 90 pages of negotiation text. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. And the first challenge is to get that down into a more manageable size and something that we can actually take into Paris and use as the basis for an agreement. So how the co-chairs that are running the discussions under the ADP have set up the sessions is that the first part of the discussions will be on trying to consolidate and streamline options that are very similar in the text. So in some areas we have up to 13 options, and the first step is to look at which of those are similar and just get them into a reduced list, a shorter list of options. And then while this process is happening, they'll identify some of the key areas that are sticking points, and then start negotiations to try and identify compromise solutions to how those can be simplified, or how we can reach agreement on those. For us, there are a few critical areas that need to be retained in the current text and that we definitely need to strengthen if this Paris Agreement for how we're going to approach climate change in the post-2020 is to be effective. Alex has alluded to the long-term goal. We definitely need to see there that the 1.5 and 2 degrees objectives are captured. 2 degrees was agreed in Cancun, but we know that for the survival of many countries, 1.5 degrees is already pushing the limits of what they can adapt to. This is a temperature goal is also very difficult to quantify in terms of whether we're doing enough or not. So we think that it is useful to have that underpinned by targets to phase out fossil fuel emissions, and then importantly, to replace that with renewable energy sources. Other ways of doing that is maybe talking about long-term objectives for zero emissions by 2050, decarbonization, or recognizing that we have a very limited carbon budget that the IPCC has actually identified for us. So if that's the first part, then the second one that stands equal to that is that we need a global goal for adaptation. People are already experiencing the impacts, and Hajit will talk about that as well. And it needs to be reflected that if we have a limited level of mitigation action, that only means we need more adaptation. And then we need to recognize that there's also a limit to what we can adapt to. So loss and damage, which happens when you haven't mitigated enough, climate change strikes, you can only adapt to rising sea levels up to a certain point, and then you start suffering permanent loss and damage. So we believe that should be a separate part of the agreement and recognized as such. We need the agreement to clearly indicate that increased levels of finance will be available in the post-2020 framework to put us on this alternative low-carbon development path. And then, like Alex has mentioned, we are seeing that the INDCs that are coming out, that indicate what governments intend to do in the post-2020 period, are actually not sufficient in terms of what we need them to be. So the agreement clearly needs to put in place mechanisms and a framework that we can use to relook at those targets and scale them up. We've had a lot of discussions about the ratchet mechanism, and somebody explained the ratchet is actually, in English, it's a tool where you keep tightening a screw. And that's what we need to do. We need to incrementally tighten that until we are in line with what we need to be according to the science. So those are the key issues we believe that need to be captured. And then in Bonn, we need to start talking about the typical issues that tend to break down negotiations at the last minute and that keep us all there sort of at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 2 days after the session should have finished. So we need parties to start open and frank discussions about the key issues of equity and differentiation and start putting out what the options are on those, and also try and identify some landing ground on the legal form. The second part of the key issues that I've identified here for Bonn is actually also very critical and very important to watch. And it's the workstream 2 discussions on pre-2020. And that links to a lot of what's happening in the real world. So what we're having here this week on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday is what they're calling technical expert meetings to look at how we can increase renewable energy and increase energy efficiency. And what we need to do is that we need to come out of Bonn, having moved beyond just those open-ended conversations, to start identifying how the international process can implement some programs to help increase those efforts on renewable energy and energy efficiency. What's very important to recognize is that we have governments sitting here that will most likely only be in charge until 2020. And yet they're negotiating what their successors and their successors' successors and even beyond that will be doing. So we can't lose focus and just look at an agreement that will only have objectives for 2025, 2050, or even 2100. This discussion about how we will do more in the 2020 period is where we get to hold our current leaders accountable. So what we need to in Bonn is that we need a draft text to come out, and that draft text needs to increase political attention to this issue. We need to address the remaining barriers through finance and technology support. And we need to recognize that the sectors of renewable energy and energy efficiency are blooming already out there, that there's much potential, but that we actually need governments and the international process to ensure that that action is the pace of that is hastened so that we can actually increase what we're doing to combat climate change now. And then finally, and very importantly, what we need to recognize is that in this period, we are still operating under the current framework, and we need developed countries to be doing more. They need to be increasing their targets and taking on more actions, offering more support in line with what the original agreed convention says. So in closing, there's a lot of attention on the workstream 1 discussions and what will be the agreement in Paris, but we cannot allow that distract us from the fact that we need to do more in the next 5 years. And if we don't do more now, it won't matter so much what we do in the next 10 or 15 years. And we need to build momentum towards that and make sure that it is still possible to achieve our temperature objectives. Thanks.
As we sit here, India is suffering from an exceptional heat wave. Working now. As we sit here, India is going through exceptional heat wave, quite unprecedented. Some parts of India saw 47 degrees Celsius in this season, and 2,000 people have lost their lives. And in the neighboring country, Nepal, we saw erratic, unseasonal rains. And imagine people who were already rendered homeless by a massive earthquake were facing difficulties, and they had no roof over their heads. And I'm also hearing from colleagues that even Chad is suffering from an unprecedented heat wave, but media is not capturing that. They're probably not even aware that it's because of climate change. And in all these cases, the connection to climate change is quite clear. We all know that 2014 was the hottest year ever recorded. And not just that, 9 out of 10 hottest year ever were all in the last decade. So that's the kind of uh, impact of global warming we are seeing and how people are getting impacted. So the message is very clear. Climate change is happening now. And what we need to understand is the lag in the system. The impacts that we are facing now is because of the past emissions that we saw in the last century or so, which also means that even if we have ambitious targets, even if we all turn green now, the impacts will continue for the next 50 to 100 years. So working on adaptation, dealing with the impacts is no more an option. We can't just look at Paris deal only talking about mitigation, because the impacts will continue for the next 50 to 100 years. So adaptation has to be a core component of the Paris deal. So what we are what we are demanding here, we want to see a global goal on adaptation in line with, like colleagues are saying about the long-term goal on mitigation. We also need to see a global goal on adaptation, which clearly talks about building resilience of people. And that goal has to be linked with the rising temperature scenario. So if we are saying that we need to build resilience of all communities around the world, which clearly means that we need to continue shifting and enhancing the means of implementation to reach that global goal. So the goal may sound subjective, but the actions need to be very objective in terms of means of implementation, providing capacity building and financial support. So that's the kind of parity we need to see between mitigation and adaptation. But that's not enough. When we say 2,000 people lost their lives, that's not adaptation. That means adaptation failed. We were not prepared to deal with these kind of impacts. And we should have prepared ourselves 20 years ago, and we have not done so. That means we have already reached a stage where we are witnessing loss and damage. So loss and damage, let's recognize, is a third era, is a third pillar of the climate negotiations and the talks that we are having here, which clearly means, and when we talk about loss and damage, we are talking about sea level rise, increasing desertification, ocean acidification, glacial melt, impacts that we have not been having much experience to deal with. That means new science is required, new knowledge generation is required. It's a separate body of work. Yes, loss and damage does talk about finance, it does talk about issues of compensation, but it goes much beyond. It's about global community coming together, whether it's global north or global south, all have to deal with that. Sea level rise is a phenomenon that we have not had the experience to deal with. And countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, all are witnessing the impacts of sea level rise. That means that third pillar has to be recognized in the New Deal. And what we want in Bonn, as we know that there's a 90-page text, all options are there. Even in loss and damage, there's an option of no option on loss and damage. And I don't think we have an option of keeping that no option. That has to be thrown out of the window. So we have to deal with loss and damage. And similarly, adaptation and loss and damage have to be brought in parity with mitigation. As I said, the impacts will continue for the next 50 to 100 years. There is a Warsaw International Mechanism, and we need to make sure that Paris deal anchors that. So here in Bonn, we need to streamline all that. There are some good options on global goal on adaptation. Text is there, dispersed here and there. That needs to be brought together. And the next draft that we are going to see on 4th of June, hopefully we'll have that kind of cleaning up of text and a political move to keep both adaptation and loss and damage strongly for the Paris agreement. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panel. I'd like to open the floor for questions. So if you have one, please let me know.
Okay, so thanks for sticking with us. Sorry about the video technical difficulties in the beginning there. We're just figuring out how to rebroadcast videos and having some internet issues. I'm back with Chris Wright, who is in the Bonn World Conference Center. There's Raquel Rosenberg, and we have a few questions coming in on Twitter for folks. So just throwing those out there. Let's see if I can't track them down. If you have any questions, you'd like to join the conversation about anything that you've heard in the webinar so far, or about the negotiations, state of play on day one, feel free to tweet to us at #ClimateTracker. So #ClimateTracker, one word. So let me go take a look. Ayin, I believe, who's in the Philippines, asked us about the giant gap between the INDCs, between the pledges that are on the table so far, and basically what science is telling us we need to deliver. I think those of you who are tuned into the press conference heard a little bit about that. For those climate trackers out there, Raquel, Chris, how can they track closing the gap? There's Fede as well. So how can our trackers follow the conversation around closing this giant gap between pledges on the table and what climate science is telling us needs to happen?
All right, so I think one of the key things that you can do at home is really look into your country's INDC. So for those countries who have already presented INDCs, any trackers in the EU, trackers in Russia, obviously, trackers in a few other countries like Mexico, and there's a few other INDCs that are coming out quite soon that we're expecting. We should be expecting Japan. They've already got a draft out. We should be expecting China pretty soon. There's word that Ghana could be producing an INDC that's pretty great, coming out pretty soon. So anyone at home who's kind of already got an INDC out or has one coming that they know about pretty soon, I would really encourage you to dive into that INDC that's out, or whatever kind of rumors you've heard about the draft, and really think about if that is equitable, if that matches the science right now, and if that is kind of something that you think will drive other countries to kind of fill that gap. And that's one great way of doing it. But for everyone else, the majority of people who are still kind of waiting on their country to even give an indication what their INDC would be, now is the time to really push what you think should be in it. In a lot of countries, they've opened up consultations on ideas of what they think the INDC should be. But a lot of countries, they haven't. And you can take that and use it as a hook. Use the fact that a number of countries have opened up these consultations and say, why doesn't your country open up these consultations? And this is not necessarily a developed or developing world divide either. Chile has had a very open consultation on their INDCs. Peru has also had an open consultation. Mexico has had an open consultation on the INDCs. I know South Africa is undergoing a very collaborative, and then kind of a number of developed countries like Australia is also kind of open up their consultation right now. And obviously Japan has released this draft, which it wanted to release it
Looks like Chris might be frozen there. He was just mentioning Japan, which has a draft climate action plan, their intended nationally determined contribution, INDC, that's sort of been circulated in the media. And a lot of our partners who have crunched the numbers show that that's wholly inadequate, not on par with some of the other major emitters' contributions that have come out on the table. And since it is still in a draft form, there's an opportunity for Japan to bump that up before making it sort of their final INDC that they make public. Still, a lot of the contributions that have come from major emitters don't add up to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, which is what a lot of the most vulnerable countries need to safeguard their future in the face of climate change. So what do we do about that? I think you heard in the press conference a little bit about this ratchet up mechanism or tools over the course of this week, little pieces of the the text or this new agreement that are going to enable us to continually push countries to improve their pledges. So we know that Paris may not leave us on the 2-degree path, but countries will also know that in coming years, on a 5-year cycle, maybe, if we can secure that in the agreement, they'll have to bring a stronger pledge and a stronger pledge, and we'll work to ensure the agreement doesn't allow for backsliding. So lots of little things that we can do to ensure that we're constantly in the coming years ratcheting up both the mitigation action as well as support and for finance, climate finance support, for adaptation, for mitigation, for technology. All of the different pieces of our response to climate change need to be increased, and we hope that we can build the architecture that helps us deliver that.
Josh,
Fede,
you just mentioned something kind of interesting. What do you mean by a ratchet mechanism?
So you guys were off the call, I think, when we were talking this through, but we'll dig into that this week, and we can also point you to a few blogs that break it down over Twitter. So we have a question from Pavlos. Fede, maybe you can field this one for the trackers out there who want to learn more about who their negotiators are. Pavlos wants to know who Greece's negotiators are and how he finds out who's representing what I assume is his country. So he's probably not the only one who wants to know who their negotiators are. If you're not in Bonn, how do you do it?
All right. Well, first of all, usually the list of participants to the conference is published online, so you should be able to find online the list of delegates from your government who are attending a conference. Particularly for the COP, you can also read a provisional list of participants, and that should enable you to know in advance who should be taking part to the event a few days in advance. And this will give you the chance to perhaps try to establish a contact with them. The second thing you should do, which is not very easy if your country is part of the European Union, is finding the office of your country, if there is any. I said that it's not easy because the European Union acts at the conference as a unique body made of 28 member states. So this means that, for example, when delivering interventions, you don't have like Italy, Greece, or France delivering speeches, but you have just one representative for the European Union. So this makes it a bit harder for European countries to identify negotiators and who actually represents and can have an impact on a specific topic. With that said, as I mentioned, you should be able to find the names of your delegates online, and perhaps you can try to establish a contact with them. And when you meet them around, you can try to look for the flag in the plenary room with the name of the country, and perhaps try to chat with them if you're allowed to reach them.
Thanks, Fede. Guys, it's just day one, and maybe we don't have the clearest sense of this, but Diego, one of our fellow trackers from Lima, tweeted the question, what are the prospects for human rights in the text, in the current text? Can any of you speak to that?
Well, so we've had some wonderful kind of advances in human rights in Geneva earlier in the year, and I definitely think that this Bonn session we're going to want to build on some of those things. So we had some advances in kind of language on health, language on human rights, language on one of Federico's passions, intergenerational equity, which all kind of really comes under the banner of rights. And I know we just bumped into Sebastian Dyck, who's one of the leaders on human rights here, and he's in a pretty positive mood. And he'll be hosting a kind of a big side event tomorrow, which he's pretty excited about. So why don't we kind of take that question on notice, and I'll go to that side event and I'll ask Sebastian, and we'll get some feedback for everyone tomorrow.
Thanks, Chris. I think that's a great idea. Jason wants to know how he finds out if his country has an INDC. So where do trackers look to see if their country has put one in, or how do they learn more about what their country's plans are?
You can find all INDCs which were submitted in the UNFCCC website. So go to www.unfccc.int, and there is a specific area in the website which is dedicated to INDCs. So you can find there all the INDCs which were submitted by countries.
Yeah, there's also a number of other blogs online. You know, a number of the blogs that we've published on Adopt a Negotiator have talked about a lot of the countries that have submitted INDCs so far. And there's a number of partner organizations like World Resources Institute, Climate Nexus, Carbon Tracker. They've all been kind of following the INDCs as they've come in. And I just encourage any of you also, if you are kind of unsure, we've got a really active Facebook group. We've got a really active Twitter hashtag going on. If you have any questions, just tweet it out there. Just put it out to the Facebook group, and collectively, I'm sure we'll be able to answer it really, really fast, and perhaps be able to turn something into an article. So reach out to the fellow trackers, reach out to us online, and we'll be able to help you there.
Thanks, guys. So that's it for questions that I see right now. Apologies if you sent a question and I haven't spotted it. Chris, you want to just wrap us up here and tell us what the next sort of big webinar is for folks, and maybe what to do in the meantime? Summarize some of the stuff that you talked about earlier.
Sure. So our next action is we're going to be taking all of your articles and we're going to be handing them to negotiators in and around these rooms in negotiating settings, and they're going to be reading those and kind of reflecting on those as they make their decisions this week. So that's going to be really exciting. Then we're going to be also kind of
some of your articles. I don't know that we'll be able to do all, but we're definitely going to try and get as many as we can out there.
Yeah, for sure. And it's going to be a task for me as well. There's a lot of you who are writing from countries where I don't know those negotiators very well. So I'm going to have to be reaching out to them, and I'll do my best that I can. But I'm sure that a lot of your articles will be seen by some really important people. So from here on in, we're going to be hosting a number of those kind of small trainings on the basics of the UNFCCC, and that will be kind of something that I hope will be really interesting for a lot of you, and that will include some really interesting NGO and negotiating leaders. And then we're going to host a few other webinars. There's going to be definitely a webinar Monday next week around about the same time as well. There's also going to be a few other webinars, at least one this week and another one next week. We're finalizing those times right now, but we'll send out an email as soon as we know, and as soon as we've got everything lined up, so you guys all know when to connect and how you can connect. And like I said, some of those webinars are going to be in some languages that you've really been asking for. So we're doing our best to try and respond to that and making this as open as possible for everyone involved.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. We hope that in the coming webinars and opportunities for us to connect, we can sort out slightly better Wi-Fi situations and work out some of these technical challenges that we had today. But overall, I think we were able to get most of this information to you. So thanks, and hit us up on Facebook, on Twitter. You have our email. Chris has sent you some of you Climate Trackers messages. I've sent you some messages. Fede is going to be blogging like mad, and you can find him on Twitter along with Raquel and some of the other Climate Trackers Chris mentioned. So we look forward to hopefully working with you in the coming weeks. Thanks for joining us.